Friday plans. He'll come early on Friday to set the table, right? Audrey heard her mother's voice through the phone, crisp and commanding, as if she had already decided the answer. Audrey pressed the phone tighter against her ear, caught off guard by the question. Wait, what's happening on Friday? The dinner party for Brian's promotion, her mother responded, as if it should have been obvious. Audrey frowned and switched the phone to her other ear. I wasn't invited. Well, of course not, her mother said dismissively. It's mostly Brian's colleagues and friends. You wouldn't really fit in. The words hit Audrey like a slap. She took a breath, keeping her voice neutral despite the sting. But you still want me to come and set the table? Exactly, her mother said brightly. You're so good at these things, Audrey. You've always had an eye for detail. And don't worry about staying long, just help set up and make sure everything is ready. I'll handle it from there. Audrey closed her eyes, letting the words sink in. Once again, she wasn't good enough to be a guest, but she was necessary when it came to doing the work behind the scenes. Her name was Audrey, and in her family, she was nothing more than a reliable extra, the one they called when they needed help, but never the one they included, the one expected to make everything perfect, yet never part of the celebration. She had been overlooked and underestimated for years, but somehow, her mother's casual dismissal still cut deep. That's fine, she said finally, her voice steady even though anger simmered beneath the surface. What time do you want me there? 4 o'clock sharp, her mother answered cheerfully. We'll need time to get the table set, the candles lit, and the appetizers plated. Oh, and could you bring some extra napkins? We might run out. Sure, Audrey said, forcing a tight smile that her mother couldn't see. Thanks, Audrey, you're such a lifesaver, her mother added before hanging up, not even waiting for a goodbye. Audrey set her phone down and stared out the window of her small apartment. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She had moved out years ago to escape this exact dynamic, but no amount of distance seemed to matter. They still treated her the same way. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was a notification from an old reservation app she hadn't used in months. Suggested for you, a table for one at your favorite restaurant this Friday night. Her finger hovered over the screen. She hesitated for only a moment before tapping reserve. For once, they could manage without her. Thursday afternoon. By Thursday afternoon, Audrey's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Don't forget to pick up the extra napkins, one text from her mother read. Brian's boss is bringing his wife, so make sure the table settings are perfect, said another. Each message made her grip her phone tighter. They hadn't even asked if she wanted to help, they just assumed she'd show up, like always. But this time, she had other plans. Living in her own apartment was supposed to give her space from their constant demands, and for the most part, it had, but when it came to family events, distance didn't seem to matter. She was still dependable Audrey, the one they could always count on to make sure things ran smoothly. She stared at the confirmation email for her Friday night reservation. A small part of her felt guilty. Was it wrong to leave them hanging when they clearly needed help? But then she thought about all the times she had dropped everything for them, only to be ignored, dismissed, or excluded. This wasn't just about Friday night. It was about years of being overlooked. No, she thought, silencing her phone. This time, they could figure it out on their own. Friday morning, her mother called. Audrey, just a quick reminder to be here by 4, she said cheerfully. We're counting on you to make sure everything's ready before the guests arrive. Audrey hesitated for a beat before answering. Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of it. Oh, good, her mother said, clearly relieved. You always know how to make things perfect. I don't know what we'd do without you. Yeah, Audrey said softly, I know. As the day went on, she got ready, not for the dinner party, but for her own plans. She put on her favorite dress, did her makeup, and grabbed her purse, feeling a strange mix of nerves and excitement. When she locked the door to her apartment and stepped into the cool evening air, she felt lighter. For the first time in years, she wasn't putting their needs above her own. By 7:30, she was seated at her favorite table, a glass of wine in hand, and a smile on her face. Let them figure it out. Tonight, they were on their own. At her parents' house. Meanwhile, back at her parents' house, chaos erupted. Where is she? Her mother demanded, pacing back and forth in the kitchen. Her voice had that sharp edge it always got when things weren't going according to plan. She said she'd be here, her father replied, sounding uncertain. Maybe she got held up. Held up? Her mother snapped. She knew how important tonight was. How could she just disappear? Brian strolled in, adjusting his tie with a smirk. Honestly, I don't know why you keep relying on her. She's always been flaky. Flaky? Their father echoed, frowning. She's done everything for this family. Well, she's not here now, their mother muttered, panic creeping into her voice. The table's not set, the candles aren't lit, and the appetizers are still in the fridge. What am I supposed to tell our guests? Brian shrugged. Not my problem, maybe next time. Don't put all your faith in someone who… Enough, their father interrupted. The doorbell rang. The first guests had arrived, stepping into a house that was anything but ready. At the restaurant. Meanwhile, Audrey was halfway through her dessert, blissfully unaware of the chaos at home. The tiramisu melted in her mouth as she took another bite, savoring the rich layers of espresso-soaked ladyfingers and mascarpone cream. Across the restaurant, a couple was celebrating an anniversary, their laughter filling the air. It felt good to be here, surrounded by warmth and light, instead of back home where she was only valued for what she could do, not for who she was. Her phone buzzed again, but she didn't even glance at it. Tonight, their emergencies weren't hers to solve. For once, she was exactly where she was meant to be. I took a deep breath and said calmly, Audrey would handle it. My mom, however, wasn't having it. She shot me a sharp look and replied, her voice cutting through the room, but she's not here, is she? Across the dining table, Brian leaned back in his chair, swirling the drink in his glass with little interest in the growing tension. He let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled his eyes. Can we all just relax? No one cares about the tablecloth or whatever else you're stressing about. Can we just eat? Mom's face turned red, frustration bubbling over. Brian, this is your dinner party. You could at least pretend to care about the details. One of Brian's friends, who had been lazily observing the conversation, chuckled and muttered under his breath, maybe you should have invited someone who actually knows how to throw a party. His words were just loud enough for Mom to hear, and for a second, her face went completely blank before twisting into barely contained fury. I knew that look well. It was the look that preceded a long-winded rant about ungratefulness and lack of effort. But before she could let loose, another voice cut through the tension, one I didn't recognize. I wasn't sitting with them at the main table. Instead, I had chosen a quieter spot, away from the drama, and was thoroughly enjoying a rich slice of cheesecake. Across from me, a couple was chatting with the waiter, sharing stories about their recent trip to the Amalfi Coast. They described the breathtaking cliffs, the deep blue waters, and the tiny cafes tucked away in winding streets. As I listened, something stirred inside me, a longing, a desire to step beyond the world I had always known. My family had kept me bound to obligations, expectations, and responsibilities that never truly felt like my own. But listening to these travelers, I realized there was so much more out there, so many places to see, experiences to have, and memories to create, ones that weren't tied to pleasing others. I made a silent promise to myself, I would make travel a priority, and more than that, I would make my own happiness a priority. Just as I took another bite of my dessert, my phone buzzed. I glanced down to see a message from my dad. We're sorry, Audrey, we shouldn't have assumed you'd handle everything. Can we talk later? I stared at the words for a long moment, my emotions twisting between satisfaction and relief. They had finally realized what they had been taking for granted. But tonight wasn't about them, it was about me. With a deep breath, I turned off my phone and signaled for the check. When I stepped outside, the crisp night air greeted me, a stark contrast to the tension I had left behind. The restaurant was still bustling, but the quiet street felt like a different world. I walked slowly to my car, each step feeling lighter than the last. For once, I wasn't weighed down by obligations. I had made a choice for myself, and it felt freeing. As I started the engine, my phone vibrated again. I hesitated but eventually picked it up. Another message from Dad. Dinner's over. Your mom is furious, but I think she understands now. Can we talk tomorrow, please? I let out a slow exhale, my fingers tightening around the phone. Was this real regret, or just another attempt to drag me back into the role they had always assigned me? I placed the phone face down and drove home in silence, unwilling to let them dictate my night any longer. Back at the house, the fallout of my absence was playing out just as I expected. Guests had left early, citing long drives and early mornings. The kitchen was a disaster, dirty dishes piled high, half-eaten meals abandoned, and the once pristine tablecloth now stained with wine and crumbs. Brian had already retreated to the couch, mindlessly scrolling on his phone, showing no signs of guilt or concern. Meanwhile, my mom stood in the middle of the mess, arms crossed tightly, her expression stormy. This wouldn't have happened if Audrey had been here, she muttered under her breath before slamming a plate into the sink. Dad, standing beside her, let out a tired sigh. Maybe, he said, or maybe we shouldn't have expected her to handle everything in the first place. Mom turned to him sharply, her eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Dad met her gaze evenly. It means that Audrey has done more for this family than we've ever given her credit for, and maybe it's time we start appreciating her instead of just assuming she'll always take care of things. For once, Mom didn't fire back immediately. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked away, her expression unreadable. By the time I got home, my phone had gone silent. I slipped off my shoes, poured myself a glass of water, and collapsed onto the couch. A deep sense of calm settled over me. Tonight hadn't been perfect. Years of being overlooked wouldn't be undone in one night. But this was a start. I had set a boundary, and I had stuck to it. As I turned off the lights and got ready for bed, my dad's last message lingered in my mind. Maybe I'd call him tomorrow. Maybe, but for now, I was content knowing they were sitting with the reality of life without me fixing everything. Let them figure it out for once. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in a long time. No barrage of missed calls, no frantic texts asking me to handle something. It was a small but meaningful victory. I brewed a cup of coffee and settled by the window, watching the early sunlight spill through the curtains. There were no demands, no expectations hanging over me, just peace. Around mid-morning, my phone rang. It was Dad. I hesitated before answering. Hey, Dad. Hey, Audrey, he said, his voice softer than usual. Do you have a minute? Yeah, sure. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. We shouldn't have assumed you'd take care of everything last night. That wasn't fair. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Apologies weren't common in my family, especially from my dad. It's okay, I said finally, my voice wavering. I've been feeling invisible lately, like I only matter when I'm useful. I know, Dad admitted. Your mom and I talked about it after everyone left. We realized how much we've relied on you without ever really acknowledging how much you do. Something inside me softened. That means a lot to hear. We talked a little longer before saying goodbye. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was something. And for now, that was enough.